Okay, well, hello everybody, and thank you all very much indeed for coming along to this talk, which is one of a series of winter talks that's being hosted by Health for XR, which used to be called Doctors for XR, but we're in the process of changing our name to Health for XR. Welcome to the talk. So our speaker tonight is Dr. Lynne Jones, and the title of the talk is on the screen now. The climate crisis is a refugee crisis. What can we do? And Dr. Jones is a child and adolescent psychiatrist. She's a writer, a researcher, and a long-time relief worker. She has spent her professional life setting up mental health programs in various conflict and disaster emergencies. I'm going to put a link in the chat for further information about Lynne and her work, including books she has written. We're delighted to welcome Dr. Jones this evening, and thank you very much for giving up your time to present this evening's talk. And over to you.
Well, thank you very much for giving up your time to come along and listen to me. I'm really, really flattered that you would come, and I know some of you, and I will say that some of this talk might think, well, I know this stuff. And the point of it for me is to try and connect a lot of the stuff we know about the climate emergency to the refugee emergency. And the way I'm going to do that is, first of all, kind of very arrogantly talk about myself, because it's kind of my life experiences that have taught me a lot, especially the mental health impacts, given that I'm a consultant in child and adolescent psychiatrist. I'm going to give you quite a few facts about forced displacement, because I think these need to be integrated more into our talks on climate crisis. I am going to give you a few facts that I use when I'm talking about the climate crisis and the way I frame them, because hopefully you're all going to go and do, or already doing, more talks yourself. So you are welcome to steal my slides, steal my notes. And I've learned my framing from other great speakers, people like Richard Smith at UK Hack and so on. And if I can help you in getting these messages out, please feel free to steal my slides. I've stuck this book up here because if you do want to know more about me, it's everything I have to, really the stories I have to tell are all there. And I want to end with sort of 10 things we can do, which are the things I'm doing at the present, but I hope in the discussion that we're really going to share more that you're doing and how we can do more. So lovely. I thought I'd start, you might think it a bit strange, but I've had a very, I often get an email and it's like, how do I have a career like yours? I'd love to do humanitarian work, blah, blah, blah. And my answer is always, well, I haven't had a career because I've spent my entire life not doing what I have been told to do, starting with when I was a very junior doctor. We called them house officers in those days, very military. And my boss said, what are you going to do? And I said, I was thinking about psychiatry. And he said, what would a nice young woman like you want to go into a profession like that for? So that wasn't a good start. But then I thought, okay, I'll do some A&E, which I thought would be useful wherever I went. But at the same time, there was this kind of disaster going on in the country. When isn't there? It was called cruise missiles and theatre nuclear weapons. And we really all did think we were on the brink of annihilation and our country would be a launch pad for nuclear war. So I went off. I told my boss I was resigning and I was going to live outside a nuclear missile base. And she said that was the end of my career. And I did still go and live outside a missile base and went to prison and got arrested a few times, which made my mother, who was a doctor, extremely unhappy. And I was told all the time, you will never, never be able to practice medicine again. Well, here I am. I was very lucky. People did employ me. Indeed, I was allowed to train as a psychiatrist. And that was all going fine until I said I wanted to do this weird thing called a PhD in social psychology and political science. And the dean of my training program said that I would never get back into medicine again, just like the whole life. And then I was very lucky. I had a very good professor when I was doing my CAMS training who let me go off and do humanitarian work, Ian Goodyear. And I'm very grateful to him because I wouldn't be able to talk to you this evening about these experiences without his support and encouragement. Finally, sort of 6 years later than everybody else that I knew, I got my CCST. And my mother, who thought I'd just been on an extended gap year for, 20 years, said, right, will you now be a proper doctor in the NHS? And I said, No, I'm going to get a job with an aid agency and go and work in Iraq, which had just had a nice intervention by Tony Blair and George Bush. And I started working in northern Kurdistan, and for the first time in my life found myself understanding what a climate-related war can do. And the misery and sadness of that is summed up so well by this girl who I met as a refugee in this camp where she'd lived her entire life. She'd lived through 5 wars. And take note that Saddam's wars against the Kurds, as well as our own war against him, sprang entirely out of our dependence on fossil fuels. And her dominant preoccupation was heat, and how refugee life had confined her and blighted her chances. Note the last bit of the quote: "We cannot go out. I've never been to school. I cannot read or write. My elder sister went to 6th grade. She speaks Arabic and Kurdish. My brother is in 2nd grade. I feel very sad." Some girls told me their lives were so miserable that they didn't want to live anymore. After I didn't say I finished, my job was to set up a program and hand it over to somebody else, and I was moved on to Chad in 2004 to work with refugees from Darfur. And this too was a climate exacerbated conflict. Increasing drought had multiplied the pre-existing tensions, which the government used to foment a genocidal war. You had pastoralists trying to move agriculturalists off their land. It's still continuing. To date, some 3 million people have been affected as Lake Chad itself continues to shrink, and 500,000 have been killed in Darfur. They still continue to flee into Chad. And this woman, Tabitha, showed me what hunger means for mother and child. She was brought to me because people said she was going crazy and she had put her child under a hedge and she had abandoned the baby. And as I got to examine her and see her, I thought that it wasn't actually craziness, it was hunger, which was making her delirious to an extent. And she thought her baby was dying because the baby wasn't responding anymore, and you get this vicious cycle: an unresponsive baby, a neglectful mother, a depressed mother. And we took them both to the therapeutic feeding center. And of course, they were both fed and they began to improve. But I noticed something there. It was totally silent. Mothers didn't look at or play with their children. And just a quick reminder for those of you who are not medical, the developing brain needs adequate nutrition, we know that, maternal love, and play and stimulation. And you need all of those things. And if they're absent, especially in the first 3 years of life, you have lifelong damage and a complete loss of human potential. Starvation kills in many ways. Now, I and my husband, as Mamu, have spent most of our professional lives working on programs that address those problems. But I would like to be in a situation where we didn't have them in the first place. Prevention has to be better than cure. So I don't know how to do this, but if you want to write in the chat or shout out, turn on your microphone and call out, where is this? It's 2005, to give you a clue. I just thought I'd put in a little quiz. Where is this? Anyone know? Quick, yes?
It's New Orleans.
Yes, who is that? Clever person.
It's me. It's I remember that event because we organized some actions around that time. It was like the first climate disaster.
You're better than my humanitarian students who I teach every year who go, oh, Aceh, whatever. Anyway, it's a Category 5 hurricane. And it taught me that there is no such thing as a natural disaster. This was a climate-induced disaster, and the city was totally devastated. But the people who suffered most were those in the lower 9th ward, which was already 4 feet below sea level. The levees failed, and most of the destruction occurred here. To quote one report, the lower 9th ward came to represent the convergence of destructive forces on a society: the hurricane, the geographical vulnerability of New Orleans, government neglect, urban poverty, and racial polarization. And I witnessed what happened to those who were evacuated to FEMA caravans in national parks. So it was all very pretty holiday parks, but there was no transport, no local communities, completely broken up, no local shops, high levels of psychosocial distress and drug abuse. And a report in 2018 said, from a reverend from that area, we still don't have grocery stores. We still don't have department stores or food chain stores. We have nothing that we had before Katrina. Everything was destroyed. Well, I then moved on to the Somali border, where I and my husband worked in this camp in 2007, from 2007 to 2009. The conflict there has been going on for as long as I can remember, but it's only now that I understand the degree to which drought and famine contributed to this particular round of fighting. Most of the refugees pouring into this camp in Ethiopia were fleeing al-Shabaab, an African equivalent of ISIS. And why was al-Shabaab getting so successful in Somalia? Because they were the group that controlled access to food and water and security. And as the ever-persistent droughts grew longer and larger, why not join them? Climate change feeds terrorism. People often say to me when I'm going to these places, oh, you're going to be dealing with all this trauma. And I say, well, actually, no. One of the things I want to flag is one of the most important mental health effects of any disaster, and indeed before a disaster has occurred, is grief and loss. The little boy in this picture lost both his parents in Hurricane Haiyan in the Philippines in 2014, one of the catastrophic hurricanes that are growing in frequency in that area every year. His mother and father couldn't swim, and so they drowned. He feels so strongly connected to the family that he comes with a friend to clean the mateship grade every day. He lost his home, he lost his school, you can see the ruins behind him. And the pain caused by these losses, I need to emphasize, is completely normal. But recovery from grief, which is what I'm trying to help with, comes from being able to mourn properly with support from a surrounding community. Now, how do you mourn if your surrounding community looks like this? And when grief is combined with the fear of everything happening again, many families told me that simply hearing the wind blow strongly at night was enough to make their children cry. And even if no one dies, loss is the central experience of being displaced. I put a list here of the kind of losses people tell me affect them. I do a kind of workshop in every place I work, and I ask people, what have they lost? And these are the sort of things they come up with. Familiar landscapes, familiar food are deeply missed. And the internal losses of dignity, security, identity, and hope for the future are often the most profound. And the indignity of a displaced life is exemplified by this child's question. The dog lives in a home. This is a child on Lesbos. How come we live in tents? Since 2015, I've mostly worked, because I have a part-time consultant job in the UK, so I divided my time between that job and the migrant crisis in Europe as the disasters came home to us. People were living in some of the most horrendous conditions that I have ever seen on every European border. And this has created the greatest mental health stresses that I've encountered. High rates of self-harm, desperate protests like the one you see in the picture. I knew this man, he promised me he was not going to do this. He then went and did this an hour later as a protest on the border of Macedonia, which was closed to him. I'm glad to say that he survived without severe burns. The fire was put out. And children also complain that parents who never beat them at home now do so regularly because they themselves are stressed. What have they done to deserve this? I thought before I go further, because I'm going to get a little bit more into statistics now and away from personal stories, I would give you, for your interest, some definitions. To be clear, I use the term migrant all the time because it's an all-encompassing term. It includes those who move voluntarily, like my own grandfather, who came from Vienna as an Austrian Jew to get a job in this country long before the Second World War, I'm glad to say. That includes the people who take care of my mother, who has dementia. They are all migrants, and thank God they're here. They're amazing. But it also includes people who are forcibly displaced, and it includes refugees, and it includes internally displaced people who are displaced within their own country. Now, actually, I think one of the most, oh, yes, sorry, I've also got the definition of a refugee in case any of you don't know it. Someone who is unable or unwilling to return to their country of origin because of a well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, or political opinion. And as you see, climate is not up there. But here is the really interesting thing. In 2020, the UN Committee on Human Rights acknowledged that forcing someone to return to a state where there is life-threatening conditions caused by climate change and environmental degradation may violate their rights. Now, they were ruling on an applicant who'd gone to New Zealand who didn't want to be returned to his devastated island, and they said, no, you can be returned because the island's not so bad and people there can take care of you. It's a complicated case, you can look it up. But the point is, in making that ruling, they said, if the island was uninhabitable or dangerous and they couldn't take care of you, you would have an abuse of your rights. And we're waiting to see kind of legally who will take that further, because it's very important. Okay, I do like the fact that the UNHCR uses the term forcibly displaced, and I will recommend that. I'd like to tell you that's getting better. Well, in 20 years, am I laughing? In the 20 years that I've been doing this kind of work, it's just got steadily worse. There are now 103 million forcibly displaced people in the world, and that means that 1 in every 78 people on Earth has been forced to flee their homes. Just take that in. Double the number of 2 years ago. Now, 60% of those move within their own country. And those that do flee across borders are mostly staying in the poorer countries of the world. These are the countries they come from. Ukraine is not on that list because UNHCR produces its figures in the middle of 22. It'll give you the figures for 21. In June of this year, I'll get the figures for 22. You can look them up online, they're easily available, but it means that we're slightly out of date, although half of that 12 million people have gone home again to Ukraine, which is also very interesting. Interesting to see how many Venezuelan refugees there are in the world. Okay, now even more interesting is where are they going? Do you see UK or United States on the top hosting countries? No. UK, France, they are not there. Turkey, amazing. Problems they're having today, it's heartbreaking. Colombia, one of the major hosting countries in the world. Uganda, outstanding in its welcome to refugees. Pakistan, taking these refugees. And Germany, Germany is up there. But note the other graph. 83% of forcibly displaced people are hosted in low and middle income countries. Please tell that to your own MP when he talks about the wonderful welcome that we provide for refugees in this country. Sorry. Okay, let's get on to the climate crisis, because the other thing that UNHCR says quite clearly, repeatedly, is that climate change is a defining crisis of our time. And disaster displacement is one of its most devastating consequences. I'm going to read this slide because it's so important. Hazards resulting from the increasing intensity and frequency of extreme weather events such as abnormally heavy rainfall, prolonged droughts, desertification, environmental degradation, or sea level rise and cyclones are already causing an average of more than 20 million people to leave their homes and move to other regions in their countries each year. So I'm going to go through slides with which you're probably, many of you, terribly familiar, but I want to show you how I use them in this context. And forgive me if you think, oh, this is boring, I know this. I think we just have to know this stuff so it's so fluent. This chart shows you how global average temperatures have been rising along with carbon dioxide. You just can't deny the facts. There they are. The red line is the concentration of carbon dioxide in the past 2,000 years, and the blue squiggly one is rising temperatures since 1880. And it's very simple, and I have these discussions with my own dear MP. Before the Industrial Revolution, carbon dioxide was 280 parts per million. When we started burning up all that carbon that was in the ground in the form of fossil fuels, namely coal, oil and gas, then the carbon dioxide came out of the ground into the atmosphere, and it's now 419 parts per million. And this is the frightening bit. That is the highest level in 3 million years. The last time there was this much carbon, there were trees growing in Antarctica and no human beings on the planet. And the bit I add from my Cornish MP is that he would not be able to get the train past Dawlish. You know, Dawlish is a bit that always goes underwater when we flood here. I find this terrifying. I find it kind of unbelievable that, you know, that 3 million years is the last time we had that much carbon in the atmosphere. This is a very useful slide. You haven't seen it before because this kind of brings it down to temperature. And it's just the last 70 years, and it has nicely in red the last 8 years, which shows you that the last 8 years have really been hotter than any others. And it shows it very clearly. We're now at 1.2 degrees of warming above the pre-industrial average. So we're really close to 1.5 degrees, and it matters. And then give the medical analogy. Thank you, Richard Smith, who got it from somewhere else, for this wonderful slide, which will be very useful to you all as health workers, because we know that if body temperature increases 2 degrees, you have a sick person and you need to take action to reduce their body temperature. And if it's more than that, you are in a really serious situation. It's mortal danger. 4 degrees, they may die if they're not dead already, and you have to treat it as an emergency. Well, it's the same with the planet. This is what my husband's home country, my home country too of Ethiopia, will look like at 4 degrees. It's all yellow. Desert. Nobody can live there. Africa, Latin America, all of Southeast Asia, most of Australia, all the United States will be uninhabitable. For many, it's uninhabitable already. People are dying now. In the Horn of Africa, they face starvation after 4 consecutive failed rainy seasons in Ethiopia, Kenya, and Somalia. It's the worst drought for 40 years. Last May, Oxfam estimated that the combined effects of climate change and conflict killed 1 person every 48 seconds in East Africa. World hunger is now, I have to change the slide every few months because the figures change, they go up. World hunger is now rising after being in decline, which is what I learned when I was at school at university. Oh, world hunger is falling. Well, 30% of the global population don't have year-round access to adequate food, and you can read the slides for yourself. Between 2030, that's just 7 years away, and 2050, there will be 250,000 additional deaths per year from malnutrition, malaria, diarrhea, and heat stress alone. Meanwhile, 4 billion people, that is half the world's population, experience water scarcity for at least once a year. By 2040, 1 in 4 children worldwide will be living in areas of extreme water stress. And as I showed in that first slide, women and children are the ones that suffer most. They're the ones that walk for the resources a camp needs, and they're increasingly exposed to danger when they do so. And all of us are familiar with what happened in Pakistan last year. In May, it had the highest temperatures in the world, and people across the region were dying from heat stroke. That didn't get so much coverage, did it? Then a few months later, a third of it, more than the size of Britain, went underwater with unusually heavy and early monsoon rains, and 33 million people were affected, 1,200 people killed, and infectious diseases are now on the rise. Flooding isn't just going to confine itself to Pakistan. Arctic regions are forming 3 times faster than the rest of the world. Rising sea levels from melting glaciers and ice sheets will push chronic floods in 3 decades higher than land that's currently home to about 300 million. You can look at where all the blue and red spots are, and you can see that, well, we might escape desertification. We are not going to escape flooding. And I'm sorry to tell you, and you probably already know this, that some of this flooding is locked in. Even if we limit warming to 1.5 degrees C, we can't stop it happening. We can't stop sea level rise happening. And it's really important, I think, when you're talking about the climate emergency, to remind people it's not just a climate emergency. It's a climate and ecological emergency. Of course, I could do a whole lecture just on that. Best thing is to quote our wonderful Secretary General, because whatever he says it brilliantly. Humanity is waging war on nature. We are facing mass extinction. 75% of the land is altered by human actions. 13% of the oceans remain as wilderness. And at the moment, we have failed to meet one single target to stop the destruction of nature. I witnessed this personally. I was working in Ethiopia last year, and I went back home to where my family live, and they're the most beautiful lakes around the village of Videle. And every year that I've gone, they are smaller. And every year that I go, there's more plastic, because the water supply and the infrastructure is too poor to cope. And so people rely on bottled water in plastic, and there's no waste disposal system, there's no system for collecting rubbish, so the rubbish gets thrown. And we know, I mean, I'm quoting something again, I'm sure you're familiar with, the amount of plastic on the planet is greater than all land animals and marine creatures combined. and I go out bird watching at this lake, and what I see, where twitches among you, this is a spoonbill stork, what I see is totally heartbreaking. It's not their fault. Okay, quick quiz. Oh, the answer, I'm sorry, I'm not good with PowerPoint on a screen. I've got the answers before I could hear from you. But I do a lot of teaching in schools, and children really, I don't know why I lost that slide, I'm so sorry. Children really, okay. Children really like this one because they like guessing, and of course most of them get it. Pigs are the most common mammal in the world. We're killing all those lovely animals that we see on David Attenborough movies, and yes, we are 36% of the biomass. I think those statistics are a little bit frightening. And this is a whole lecture in itself, which I'm not going to give, but I am going to flag. Drought, flood, fire are all effects of the climate and ecological emergencies, but the direct health effect that probably should concern health workers the most is actually air pollution. When I saw this graph, I was amazed to see that it shortens our lives, given that I'm a humanitarian worker, it shortens our lives by more years than dirty water, or AIDS, or malaria, or indeed war. Now, you need a whole talk on air pollution, and I hope Alice and Kathy will arrange that for you. But even if it doesn't kill you, I know as a psychiatrist that it has profound effects on the brain, which I find really disturbing. I'm very proud to say that the Royal College of Psychiatrists did produce a position statement, and from that, there is a really good list of the mental health impacts of the climate emergency. If you want them, I recommend you look them up. I'll just draw your attention to a few highlighted ones. Air pollution associated with anxiety, depression, neurodevelopmental effects in children, 6% of the modifiable risk for dementia. A little bit scary, really. And I also want to draw attention to the secondary effects, which brings this talk home a little bit to us. You may again be familiar with this, the research done by the Grantham Institute in 10 countries across the world, published in 2021, which showed that 6 in 10 young people between 16 and 25 were very or extremely worried by climate change. Now, I last did a talk like this in our local College of Further Education at the beginning of the year, and I just asked for an opinion poll on their anxieties and worries, and the whole class put up their hand and said they were frightened and worried. 4 in 10 young people around the world are hesitant to have children, and they fear their governments are doing too little to prevent climate catastrophe. And a similar number said governments were not protecting them, the planet, or future generations, and they felt betrayed by the older generation, that would be me, and governments. Let's be clear. As a psychiatrist, I can assure you climate anxiety is not a mental disorder. It is a rational response to government failure. And to quote Caroline Hickman, one of the authors of this report, I really like what she says: if young people are going to feel less anxious, we need our politicians to suffer more climate anxiety. And this failure of ours connected to the refugee crisis is fueling another mental health problem. Last year, I was also working in Bosnia with young Afghan children who have been on the move for most of their lives. They don't get visas to come to this country. They're fleeing a conflict absolutely not of their making, one now exacerbated by drought and floods, as well as the horrendous rule of the Taliban. And they are on the borders of one of the richest parts of the world, the European Union. Yet if they do manage to make it to this country, this is what they face. Between 2013 and 2018, the UK spent almost twice as much on sealing its borders as it did on climate finance. That tells you something. And I just want to flag this mental disorder that I've made up, and I hope people will take seriously. I call it planetary crisis denial. I think it's a syndrome, and it has a few symptoms. One is that we deny that greenhouse gases are a pollutant. We acknowledge they exist, but we don't acknowledge the polluting factor around them, killing 1 in 5 people every year, and that we have to stop fossil fuel extraction if we're going to cure it. We deny that an economy built on extraction, exploitation, and endless consumption is unsustainable. I am so tired of turning on the BBC and hearing about economic growth. When are we going to have Jason Hickel or Kate Worth on the BBC in the morning with Faisal Islam? I'd like to know. And denial that the migrant crisis is of our making, and the way to address it is reparations, not deportation. This kind of denial, I think, is really well symbolised by a Prime Minister who thinks the best way to get to Cornwall from Dorset is to fly by helicopter and private jet. The people are suffering worse consequences of the climate and ecological emergencies, as in Pakistan or the Horn of Africa, as I've described, are not those responsible for causing them. Another really useful report for all of you I recommend reading is the Oxfam 2022 report, which points that the richest 1% emit more than twice as much CO2 as the bottom 50% of the world. Inequality contributes to the death of at least one person every 4 seconds. One flight from London to Rome, there's a carbon calculator you can find on the Guardian website somewhere, and from that I worked out that one flight from London to Rome emits more CO2 than my Ethiopian sister-in-law uses in a year. That is a staggering difference. Or we can put it another way, and thank you again to Richard Smith for this slide. This gives you the number of planets required to maintain current lifestyles in different parts of the planet. And as you see, even to live in modest Western Europe, we need 3 planets. Only the lifestyle of people within Africa and Asia is within planetary boundaries. Now, I'm not obviously including rich African billionaires or very hungry, impoverished people in the UK, but you get the general idea. And this Western lifestyle came out of an industrial revolution begun in this country and built on the exploitation and transfer of resources and human beings from continents like Africa and parts of Asia. So climate justice actually requires that as a whole we change our consumption habits so that people in Africa and Asia can have some of the things we take for granted, but in a sustainable way. No, I'm not saying every African person should have an SUV. They need good transport infrastructure and electric buses. And we can pay for that. That's what paying for loss and damage is all about. So I've drawn this little diagram to help myself try and understand all the interconnections between all these facts I've given you. And please note the central one. It's consumption in the West, particularly by the richest people in the global North. And the impacts on the bottom layer are the ones we need to understand. You get hunger, poverty, disease through the habitat loss and degradation and the climate and the drought and the melting of ice. And that causes migration and conflict, which intensify. Climate change is a threat multiplier. It's a factor that can tip into violence states already staggering under the weight of other problems. As I showed you from Chad and Somalia, a drought exacerbated by climate change in a country where a government fails to provide for its people, water is already scarce, bad relations between tribes and communities are fraught. This can lead to clashes over water and then broader internal conflict, which is then exported further. So we can expect more of this. Climate and ecological crises are predicted to displace 1.2 billion people in the next 30 years. And I just want to be clear, and I recommend this poet if you don't know her already. Her name's Wartan Shah, she's from Somalia. A wonderful poem called Home. You have to understand, no one puts their children in a boat unless the water is safer than the land. Okay, I've got 5 more minutes, but what I thought I'd do, just help myself catch my breath, is I'd actually, I hope that's so, I'd like to divide up the question period. First of all, are there any questions about this kind of stuff that I've said?
So we've got a question in the chat. How do you keep sane when you are constantly exposed to all of the suffering and misery in the world? Good question.
Well, I don't know if that's directed at me personally, because I don't think I'm probably more exposed. And, you know, one of the things I realize when I come back and I sit in the CAMS clinic in Redruth and I listen to some teenager who wants to kill themselves, or who's got severe PTSD from being sexually abused by an uncle, or just is utterly miserable at school because they just don't understand that he's neurodiverse or whatever, that suffering fills, and Leonard Woolf said this actually, suffering fills the space it's given, and it's not worse. Of course, it's terrible to be starving and on the brink of death, but the mental suffering that I encounter isn't worse in one place or another. If you're suffering, you're suffering. And I suppose, like most people, I am someone who needs to be up against it. I'm at my happiest when I feel I'm trying to solve problems rather than just learning about them and doing nothing. So acting and relief work is one way of acting, is a way of keeping myself sane. You know, I of course, when the, you know, and we all have ADHD regarding disasters. So when the newest disaster hit the screens, you know, and all my friends and colleagues are in meetings and technical working groups about what to do about what's going into Turkey and Syria, God knows what, I want to help. And luckily I'm given a role. I'm doing some online teaching, you know, so I can help. I'm glad that that exists in me, and I think it exists in all of us. We want to help. Look at the outpouring. We want to help. I better get on.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would echo that. And I think a lot of the members of Health for XR feel similar to that, and that by taking action to try and raise awareness of the crises that we're in actually does help you to cope.
I'm just aware of the, yeah, thank you, Kathy.
Can we just have, I promised George his question, and then
okay, right, that's fine.
George has put, how do people recover from trauma who don't have access to specialist psychiatric help?
Oh God, George, there's a whole chapter in my book that I showed at the beginning that explains why I hate and never use the word trauma. There's a starting point for you. As I've explained, I think the predominant problem is loss. If you get onto stress and people getting stressed, I'm astonished by people's resilience. And one of the most important things, which I actually said on the radio the other day, is social connection. So number one, address their basic needs. And number two, remember that social connection and keeping children connected to parents, families connected to each other, is a basic need. Don't leave that out. And if you do those two things, you protect the majority, not all, from the severe effects of stressful events. In most disasters, so this is a whole other talk, about 25% may get PTSD. That means 75% are not getting PTSD, and the question is why. So that's a whole other talk, but just to give you a feeling of that. Sorry.
Sorry, can we squeeze in one more question?
Yeah, I mean, we have all the questions now.
We're going to come back to questions at the end as well, but so this will be the last one. Nadia, go ahead.
Hi, thanks. My question is a bit more around the evidence for, you know, how the refugee crisis is going to unfold, you know, what sort of predictions there are, because when I speak about it with people, I come up against a whole load of other evidence about how, no, it's not going to affect Europe and all the rest. And I mean, just out of lack of time, I haven't really looked into all the facts and figures to properly defend this viewpoint, but are there any predictions, and how do they differ? Because I just see the wealth of how anyone can talk themselves into believing what they want on this one.
I'm not familiar with the figures that tell you that it's not going to get worse, but our anti-migration policies are certainly getting stronger, and the walls are getting higher. And you know, if you look at the numbers of people who are drowning in the Mediterranean, I recommend the Missing Migrants website. Go on there and you see how many people are drowning in different seas, and you see the number of returns and policies on deputations. It probably is disincentivizing people coming to this country. Italy and Greece still have large numbers of people coming. Pushbacks on the Libyan side by the Libyan Coast Guard are much more punitive. Do people want to move? Yes. And look, that's why 85%, as the figures I gave you, are in neighboring countries, which are low and middle income countries. Europe has fairly effectively, and particularly Northern Europe, kept people out. So I'm not denying your people who are saying it's not a problem. They are paying more to address the problem by building higher walls, deporting people to Rwanda, electing governments that are punitive towards migrants, than they are for paying for governments who understand the climate crisis. But these policies won't work in the face of the disasters that are coming. And then, of course, we have our own disasters. So you may find that southern England is a very unattractive place to live, and you might prefer to be in, well, I say Scotland, but my sister's been having some pretty heavy flooding. It'll be hard to decide where to go.
Okay, thank you very much, everyone, for your questions there. So we'll go back to Lynne's got a few more slides, and then we'll take a few more questions at the end. Over to you.
I think, yeah, when I do these talks, and I do them a lot, I think it is really important. I really encourage you to come up with things that you can do. And I really like the fact that being a health worker makes it very easy to point out to people, and it's as simple as this. Again, the slogan is mine, but I stole the slide from Richard Smith of UK Hack, and anybody else can steal it. The climate crisis is a health opportunity. And it's very interesting for me because we have a slogan in the humanitarian world, which we throw around: crisis is an opportunity. So you arrive in Haiti and you say, we're going to build back better. You see how well we did that? Anyway, we do try. And when you look at the slide, it's got it all there. You know, walking and cycling is more fun, and it reduces air pollution, and it makes us fitter and gets rid of obesity, and we feel better, and our mental health is better. And if we have access to green and blue space, as we saw during COVID, again, we feel better. I feel better if I see trees and water, if I spend time in nature. Everybody knows that. So if you say, why don't we have a city street that looks like this? They go, wow, yeah, that'd be nice. Okay, so we need to do this and this. I'm very proud to have been involved just simply in getting the main street through the heart of Penzance into a traffic-free zone for 7 hours a day. Now, that was a major discussion, but it's so lovely when I walk down the middle of the street. Energy efficiency is cheaper. We know that. Locally sourced plant-based diets. I know there are people in this talk in the audience who can tell you far more about that, but it is so good for you. So what is not to like? That, you know, look up the bit that interests you and then share that with your neighbors and friends. And actually this, you know, number one, educating ourselves is really key. I mean, it is exhausting. I mean, I have to, you know, even the slides I've given to you today, I have to sit down and update them. Like, information is coming so fast that I have to update them more or less every couple of months. And these are some sources. Lancet Planetary Health, from our point of view, is one of the best. IPCC executive summaries. You don't have to read the whole reports. They're summarized everywhere. New Scientist has great climate change series. And I put a little link to some really lovely climate change documentaries. And I really recommend just taking a bit of time. Anything by David Attenborough can be useful, to watch these and share them with others. If I'm working with kids, David Attenborough is a great way through. Choose the audience, choose the source for the audience. So, you know, which leads me on to sharing with your families, friends and neighbors, grand rounds, seminars at work, seminars in college if you're still a student. And don't forget that because you're a doctor, it's actually not very difficult to get into the local paper. If you're a doctor, a medical student, nurse, sorry, anyone, you do get picked up by local media, or that's my experience. I mean, to my amazement, at the beginning of the Ukrainian refugee crisis, there was some woman talking about how it was nice to have Ukrainian refugees here because they were just like us, was the phrase she used. And so I immediately wrote a letter saying I hope we could extend this kind of welcome to all refugees, including just all refugees. And I was immediately read out on any answers, which was quite nice. So it is worth contributing. Now, I really recommend this website. It's down the bottom of the slide, Take the Jump, because these are a series of ideas beautifully presented in a way that you can present them to individuals, to groups, to schools. Chris Newman, GP, one of the founders of Doctors for XR, now Health for XR, and I went out on the streets of Margate around Christmas, and he'd made this wheel where basically he was shouting at people to come and spin the wheel, and loads of people came up because it was bright and it looked like fun. They'd spin the wheel, it'd land on one of these ideas, and we'd have a discussion about it. And it's so easy to do, and it's really good fun. As you can see, the children seem to be enjoying themselves. I assure you they were. Don't knock petitions. I know all activists are petitions, they don't get anywhere. Actually, petitions make an enormous difference. You know, Chartism was a big petition. And this fossil fuel treaty is something you can give to any institution that you belong to. I'm really glad to say the Royal College of Psychiatrists have just signed. Other institutions have signed, town councils are signing. It's something to look at. It's educational, and it is fossil fuel non-proliferation, no new fossil fuels. It's a really good idea. So sign petitions and circulate them. And yes, as you know, I talked to my MP. Now he died in the Walturi. And honestly, my heart sank with him when he was elected. But what I've seen over 4 or 5 years is that his position is shifting, at least not on migration, not on law and order, but on the climate crisis. I think we're getting him moving. And he is now endorsing and promoting the Climate and Ecological Emergencies Bill. And that is because we don't give up on him. Right now, a clean air bill is going through Parliament. If you do nothing else after this talk, if you tweet or write to your MP and say, would you please support Ella's bill? Ella Kissi-Debrah was a girl who died 10 years ago from air pollution. Her mother is promoting the bill. What it will do is get the government to reduce levels of PM 2.5, one of the toxic pollutants, to 10 micrograms by 2030, not by 2040. Please ask your MP to back it. I'm going to draw your attention to these scorecards because they're floating around and they're really worth knowing about. One is for schools, any students here, for educating health workers and people in colleges and institutions. It's called the Planetary Health Report Card Initiative, and you can find out all about it on the website, and then you can get your school to kind of do a check on where it is as an institution on sustainability in the climate crisis. And the other, the Climate and Health Scorecard Initiative, is being sent to colleges and other institutions. We hope to develop it to Centre Trusts. Again, both the relevant links are on the slide. And if you want to get involved in these initiatives, I know that those organising them would welcome support. This is one of my favourite. I'm old enough to have been deeply involved in anti-apartheid in the 80s. And Desmond Tutu was one of my heroes. And what he said is, if we would adopt an apartheid-style boycott, we could save the planet. It's one of the best ways to stop climate change if we use the tactics of divesting. Now, I may have got this list, may not be complete, but I know that the Royal College of Physicians, general practice, emergency medicine, and psychiatry have all divested from fossil fuels. And if your college has divested and I haven't mentioned it, then write in the chat and I will update my list immediately. 101 UK universities have promised to divest. This is brilliant. This is really powerful. Moving money, especially in this big and institutional way, is the best way of attacking the fossil fuel industries. But there's an add-on, which I think people are only beginning to understand. It matters where you invest your money. It also matters where you bank. And if you don't want to glue yourself to the road, as a journalist in The Independent said, you can do something in your bedroom, and it's called moving your money. Where do you bank? On this chart, and again, I've given you the website, you can see which are the good banks and which are the bad banks. And isn't it nice to know that actually the good banks usually have better rates and you can actually make money by moving it? And it really upsets the bad banks. Again, experience down here, I moved to Hale in '85. I was paid a check with a Barclays in Sydney on it. I said, horror to my bosses, why are we banking with Barclays? You all support me. You know I'm an activist. You've taken me on as a trainee because I'm an activist. And they said, oh, all right, we'll hold a practice meeting. And they held a practice meeting and they moved the bank account. And Barclays was furious. And they came around and gave us a talking to, but we moved the bank account. Get your hospital, get your business, get your college to move their bank account. We're in discussion with the Royal College of Psychiatrists right now. We're asking them, great that you've divested. Would you please move your bank account? Because guess where they bank? Barclays. Okay, much more information on the website there. Couple more things. You don't have to do this by yourself. Look how many of you at this meeting. It's amazing. I want to get to know you all. And there are so many groups that can join. And they all do different things and work in different ways. And they're all really important. You know, if you're someone who really likes sort of campaigning in a conventional way and writing letters and lobbying, MedAct is amazing. MedAct comes out of the Medical Campaign Against Nuclear Weapons, which I used to belong to, and I belong to MedAct now. And they are so well informed on so much, and they're working so hard. So support them. I also belong to Health Declares. I belong to Site Declares. I belong to Health for XR and my Cornish Wildlife Trust. And I also belong to something called BP or Not DP. You can look them all up. Find a group that you like, where you feel comfortable, that is educating you and acting in a way that you want to. And you'll have fun and you'll make friends. And then, whichever group you belong to, I hope you're going to end up here, because this is happening on April the 21st. Yes, it's been called by Extinction Rebellion, but all these different groups are going. It's going to be one of the most massive demonstrations ever. So please come. We are going to hold the government to account. We want you there. And thank you very much. I've talked far too much and now I want to hear from you.
Wow, thank you very much, Lynn. That was an amazing and inspiring talk. Yes, the first part was full of a lot of quite depressing facts, but also really interesting stuff. I learned quite a lot of new things I didn't know. And but yeah, a very inspiring few slides, which hopefully will get people motivated to do stuff. So we've got a few questions. So first up, we've got John Cena. Go ahead, please.
Not so much a question, rather more
Comments are great.
Things we can do. Here in the UK, we've got a government that, as you pointed out, is very hostile to refugees, and we've got a Home Secretary who dreams of sending people to Rwanda, you know, and that's created a very toxic atmosphere. You know, we just last week we had a refugee hostel with satellite. They are the government's plan is to divide us, and that's why they're whipping up all this hysteria and racism. People are focusing on refugees, they aren't really focusing on the real culprits. And so I think it's very important that we sort of stand up to racism, and that we come together. And I think it's very important that we do things like demonstrations. I think the 21st of April is very important, but so is also the 18th of March in the UK, Saturday the 18th of March. There's going to be demonstrations against racism. I'm organizing a climate justice block with a banner that I've just created for last year. I've just shared it on the chat. So if you're in London, you know, come and join our banner. And we're going to organize a large block, which will make the question of climate refugees visible to people. I think it's very important that people make the connection between the climate crisis and refugees, and how this government doesn't care about the climate crisis. It's making it worse, and is penalizing the victims of that mess that they've created. So there it is. Yeah,
absolutely, John. Good point. So let's move on to a question from Leslie, please.
Thanks very much, Lynn. That was really comprehensive. I think something that's worth flagging up in the kind of well-being, staying hopeful department is the book Active Hope, Joanna Macy and the Work That Reconnects, is a brilliant book for encouraging or giving ideas about how, as individuals and also working with groups and doing training sessions, that we can, amidst all the mess we're in, quote unquote, we can retain hope. And I think that emphasis is really good. The other just comment is, amongst the list of things we can do, the long list of things we can do, I think you implied it, but just to say, is the potential for education, whether it's special study components in first in medical school, offering an SSC on refugee health, climate change, just looking for opportunities for introducing these issues into curricula. And
I completely agree. I mean, maybe I should be more specific when I'm talking to a medical audience. There are so many opportunities. My Falmouth just did an action actually to get the climate curriculum, to get the climate crisis introduced into the curriculum. And they're now having meetings about that. And I just think there's so many opportunities. Harvard University Medical School has made it part of the curriculum. So definitely practices, greener practice, people like that, having its part. But even if you can't get it done immediately formally, start it informally. Use case discussions. I've had 2 CPD days where I've talked about the climate crisis over the last 5 years. So yeah, there are many opportunities. Thank you, Leslie.
Yeah, okay, next we've got Hoon. Would you like to ask your question?
My question is, what do you think is the impact of getting involved locally with actions such as increasing the ability of refugees to interact with others in their community? By that, I mean, when we do that, then it puts paid to the attempt of governments and other groups to other refugees. because their most powerful weapon is to present refugees as less than human. They other them.
Well, the biggest way they've kind of trod on their own foot, in a sense, is by being not sufficiently welcoming, but fairly welcome. I say not sufficiently because a lot of their plans haven't worked out, but by welcoming Ukrainian refugees. I've got two family down the street from me here in my tiny village in Cornwall. They're all over the place here, but also actually Cornwall's been quite good about refugees. We have quite a few. When they're here, you're completely right. People go, oh my goodness, I hadn't realized, you know. I want to be optimistic. I think this government is on its last legs.
Oh.
And I think we are moving to a better time. We need to, because the fortress isn't going to hold. We have to find another way of sharing the world that we live in.
I'll just share a little bit about what I'm doing. Is that we're hoping to establish gardening groups for refugees.
Great.
And the plot I just visited with a GP today is a huge allotment area in Rusholme, and it's in terms of the sort of people who work there. He works very heavily with Kurdish refugees, and I think it's absolutely brilliant because he gets people to mix. So the usual people, the usual allotmenteers who used to be your typical white old men, pardon to any white old men who are here, start to get this oh my god moment. And the oh my god moment is these people are normal. And then it's not as if, and then government messaging stops being as effective.
Yeah, I agree with him. Great, good for you. It sounds like a lovely initiative.
Yeah, I think Hoon seems to have suddenly dropped off the call there, but thank you. We've got a question from Christelle, please.
How do you, I mean, I don't know if you've ever read the book Crazy Like Us, which I found a fantastic book. But how do you, which is about how not to impose a Western mindset on other cultures when we're dealing with mental health. I just wondered how you navigate that. You know, I think it's relevant for your work, but it's also relevant with any of us who as medical professionals are dealing with refugees, which will be increased.
It gives me a nice opportunity to advertise my own book. So the book I put on the first slide, Outside the Asylum, is not entirely, but you will see as you move towards the end of the book that it is increasingly ranty about this issue and the neo-colonialism of aid, on subjects on which I teach, and the growing awareness. I think it really hit me. In 2013, I was working in Mozambique with a lovely, very famous development organization called the Aga Khan Foundation. And at the top of the hierarchy were the whitest people, the Portuguese-speaking, Portuguese-stroke Mozambicans who ran the organization, but lovely people and very well-minded. And, you know, I was sitting organizing what we did with the World Food Programme grant, and the money was going to pay for the expensive offices and staff in Maputo, and the work utterly depended on unpaid volunteers in Cabo Delgado, many of whom are suffering from serial hurricanes at the moment. And I wrote about that. I couldn't go on like that. And it's what pushed me to partly come back here and also to start working for nothing. I get my expenses paid sometimes in the informal migrant crisis, because in those situations, volunteers and refugees have created sometimes dysfunctional, sometimes more functional communities that try to, because the big aid agency is absent, that try to help. And that's been a very different experience, which I've written about in the second book called The Migrant Diaries. So you're quite right, and I'm trying to address it, but it doesn't mean going away and not trying to help. I can assure you it doesn't mean that. Kathy and Nikki both have their hands up.
Well, I think we've got Sai back again.
Oh, right.
Okay. Very mundane question from me. How do we get the slides or the recording of this? Thank you very much, Lynn. It's been great.
doctorsforxr.com. I think we're going to draw the evening to a close. I would really like to thank Lynne Jones very much indeed for a fantastic talk. Really, really interesting. Lots of useful facts and information that we can hopefully relay to other people. I think everybody's enjoyed the talk, and your presentation, it was so authentic, coming from the heart as well, and somebody that really knows what they're talking about, because you've seen all this stuff yourself firsthand, and I think that gives it a lot of value. So I think it was a really moving talk. Thank you very much indeed.
These are the talks that we've got coming up in the next couple of months. So a couple of talks in February and one in March. Health for XR has a number of kind of low risk outreach actions coming up this Saturday, various ones across the country.